This lecture will continue with the Archaic era in ancient Greece, looking at vase painting and the innovations that the Greeks are going to make there on a two-dimensional surface that eventually make their way to sculpture at the end of the period that we will look at, transitioning to the Classical era. The Archaic era directly precedes the Classical, and so we find that the necessary evolution to get to these classical philosophers and thinkers that would give us Western civilization are going to find their roots in this era. Now, the Archaic period is often dismissed as merely a necessary evolution to get to the classical, the shining beacon of Western civilization. However, we know that in the Archaic era, we already have the emergence of many very important ideas and thoughts and practices, including the coining of coinage, and once again Egyptian-inspired temples, Athenian pottery, and philosophy. In this era we already have Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes and Zeno, who was famous for Zeno's paradox. These individuals are going to add to our understanding of the Greek cosmos, which is already established in the Archaic era. The Classical era merely builds on it. Now, with Zeno's paradox, we have an excellent example of the type of philosophy that would precede the classical era, that merely reasons through certain scenarios, and is going to postulate that if given a head start, a tortoise would always outrun the famous Achilles. For, even though Achilles is very fast, the tortoise theoretically would be moving forward, and so therefore there is an infinite number of spaces that Achilles must catch up, and so it would be an infinite paradox. Now, the reason why Greeks developed these paradoxes is going to be because they do not have a religious mandate from the Bible, such as Muslims, Jews, and Christians have with their books, which of course lay down the law that God sets forth in examples like the Ten Commandments. Without this, the Greeks had to come up with their own way to understand the universe and the world they live in, how to navigate it, what they should do in it. And so philosophy and ethics were necessary inventions.
It was in this period that we see the rise of Athens as a polis power. Now, Greek vase painting is very significant and is going to run the gamut in the entire history of the periods of Greek art, from 700 to 323 BCE, or from the Orientalizing period all the way through the Hellenistic and the rise of Alexander the Great. Now, Oakley is going to note that the most abundant source of material that we have from the Greeks comes by way of these vase paintings, not architecture, not sculpture. And they provide us with information on the context of where they were found and how they were used, whether that context be religious, domestic, or ceremonial. Now, excavation reports prove quite useful if they are published within an archaeological context. Hence, we know where certain vases are found. That tells us how they were used. The problem with this is most vase paintings are not published, and we have no context for them. Thus, we have difficulty interpreting them in a proper fashion. Now, UNESCO is going to find that 1970 is officially the cutoff for legal antiquities. Therefore, you can own something prior to 1970 and have taken it out of the country, but after that it is protected. And so you cannot move antiquities from any country outside of their borders without a very strict process regulated by the host government. Therefore, looting, because it was illegal after 1970, is so common. They find these remnants and civilizations and sell them on the black market. But this disrupts these finds and destroys the context, for we don't know where something was located, only that it is a particular artifact. This is why in the geometric amphora and the Dipylon cemetery example that we've looked at already, that we understand this by way of context. Is it found in a dining room, or is it going to be found instead in a cemetery? These tell us about burial and dining practices, and where they're found is crucial. Previously, vase painting, and especially that shows myth, was the primary source of investigation, both for its iconography and iconology. And this led to the interdisciplinary and multi-country approach to the Lexicon Iconographicum Mythologiae Classicae, otherwise known as LIMC for short, that had scholars from Germany, France, England, Spain, Italy, and the Americas, all cataloging every instance of and representation of these different myths. However, now the Palais-Lasson school is going to understand these images not primarily for their sake in literature and myth, but instead interpreted through anthropology and structural linguistics. Now, these are seen not as a story, but instead as a social construct. Therefore, we have expectations of ideal behavior, not representations of reality. Therefore, in this new interpretative method, we can see that all images of women are not actually repressive, but instead they are shown as an integral part of the household, much like genre scene painting in the 17th century in Holland.
And archaic vase painting in Athens is going to be the dominant center for pottery in the Greek mainland and in the Aegean. Now, they will adopt Corinthian black figure, first practiced obviously in Corinth, and will use black figure design before switching over to red figure. Here are some examples of the variety of pots and of vases that the Greeks would paint on and illustrate images from their own history, of their great heroes, and of their gods. Now, as time is going to pass in the Archaic era, we find that the number of bands will decrease, while the number and the size of figures will also increase, until we have only one band with one narrative frieze and a scene at a time. As an example, we begin with the Francois vase, the potter and painter being Clytius and Ergomatos. We find that in many of these there will be two names associated with these painted vases. One is the potter, the first name, and the second one is the painter, the individual who decorated it. This is an excellent example from the Archaic era and a good place to begin our discussion because it is an encyclopedic representation from mythology, specifically episodes from Homer's Iliad, which is going to detail Peleus and his son Achilles, whereas Theseus, the king of Athens, is also referenced, appropriate for a vase in Athenian black figure in this volute crater. Now, this has 6 registers, and you can see that it's called black figure because the figures are painted in black. The registers are going to divide each scene from top to bottom, and we still have decorative elements that are going to carry over in the crater we looked at earlier from the Dipylon Cemetery, where we find that they do have these starburst patterns at the base of the vase, and these floral motifs on the wings of the vase, the handles. But the rest is dedicated solely to action and leaves a bit of negative space so that we can read this action.
Now, unlike the geometric and orientalizing periods of Greek vase painting, we find now that myths and gods and heroes are going to replace funerals and animals that were previously the primary subject.
In the scenes, we find that Athenians play a key role, such as Theseus here battling the centaurs, being invited by the Lapiths to a lush wedding, and then the centaurs become intoxicated and attempt to abduct the maidens and the boys. So remember, in ancient Greece, young boys and pederasty is going to be practiced, just like, of course, they would understand women to be sexual objects. The men protect their maidens and young boys by fighting these half-men, half-horses. To show how feral these beasts have become when they are drunk, they're fighting with rocks and branches, while as the men are going to fight with shields and spears dressed in hoplite armor. We now see the transition to, instead of only showing the figures fully frontal and fully in profile, we have more believable composite views as the centaur is going to be twisting towards us. So we see his torso frontally, but his arms and head are in profile. More believable than the earlier versions. They've also fleshed out the centaur's body and thought out how exactly they would come together. And so the neck of the horse now becomes the abdomen of the man.
We have in these various black figure paintings representations that are going to be labeled as well of many great Greek demigods and gods, all shown overlapping in a much more naturalistic fashion. As we can see, comparing this to the Gigantomachy we ended with last time, in order to get the same type of detail with these overlapping figures and anatomical detail, this required incising details out of the black paint itself. And of course, the result is something that is not exactly anatomically accurate, but is a move in the right direction.
Now this large series of bands and registers will decrease until we only have one register, one frieze here that's going to be illustrating monumental figures. In this case, we're still using black figure, and the Amasis painter is going to be illustrating Dionysus with the maenads. Now, at 13 inches high, this vase is going to be an amphora, and illustrates appropriately a storage jug where we could keep wine. On it we have a painting of the god of wine, Dionysus, who is being presented a dead hare or rabbit by his followers, the worshippers of Dionysus. It is signed right above the rabbit here, Amasis, so we know the painter's name. We do not know the potter's name in this instance. So maenads are going to be the female worshippers of the god of wine Dionysus, who comes from the east. They present him with an offering, generally of rabbit or deer. Because they will gather in the forests, they will become intoxicated and dance to worship this god. This is an all-female cult of Dionysus. And, importantly, theater is going to be invented to worship him. For we find the place that we look at a theater, the orchestra, is going to be the dancing place, where we're looking towards this in the theatrum. Dionysus is going to hold a canthros, or a wine cup, which you would pour from the storage jug into. And since it's appropriate that we're going to be pouring wine, and he is the god of wine, that he would be holding a vessel for drinking wine.
Images of maenads dancing before Dionysus were quite common, and we must remember that theater itself was invented to worship the god of wine, with the orchestra, or the dancing place, set up where there would be animal sacrifices, and then women would dance to musicians in order to placate and to give back to the god of wine. It is appropriate that we find his image on many of these vessels that would have carried wine as jugs or as individual drinking cups.
The increase in bandwidth and the large figures are going to allow more elaborate narratives, and the space in which the figures are going to be located becomes increasingly complex. Now, we keep the decorative patterns at the top and at the bottom of this vessel, and they are not yet entirely comfortable with negative space. We find that they favor shapes and patterns over real space at this time in 540 BCE, filling in that negative space behind Dionysus and behind the maenads with spirals and decorations that flatten out the space. Much like we saw earlier with the elaborately decorative organic motifs on Minoan pottery, especially Chimeris ware.
Turning to Ezekias, we have his Ajax and Achilles playing checkers from around 530 BCE. In this Attic black-figured amphora, we have the most famous painter and his work here that signs his work as both potter and painter. Here, the subject is a game of dice on the eve of battle for Troy. Now, it is not a literary source because we do not have this mentioned by Homer in the Iliad. However, it is showing an extra literary source, an apocryphal source, if you will, that would fill in what the soldiers would naturally be doing in their downtime as they did in wars since.
Here we find that each one of them is going to be calling out numbers, and that we can clearly tell who will win, who the greatest warrior is. They are also going to be identified in Greek with their names over their heads. This is very common in Greek pottery, so we know who gods are and who the heroes are. They are going to be holding 2 spears each, and are leaning over with their cloaks and armor on and shields behind them. However, Achilles is going to be taller because he still wears his helmet, thus showing us he will win and he is the greater warrior. So he says 4, Achilles does, showing us that he will win this match just like he is going to be the greatest warrior and will go down in history as such. So you find that the irony here is that Achilles is winning, but he is going to die in the next battle. And Ajax is going to commit suicide in despair, because as the second best warrior in Greece, he has the right to Achilles' armor. But Odysseus, in his silver tongue, talks the rest of the Greeks into giving it to him instead. So Ajax, furious, is going to commit suicide. So the next scene after this in the Iliad is going to be Achilles being killed and Ajax, right, carrying him away from the walls of Troy and to give him a proper burial. In the work here, we find that we are transitioning from the early Archaic era into one that is preceding the classical. It's the antithesis of the Archaic orientalizing action, in which we have very dramatic and violent action being carried out. Now, you'll notice, we're going to see the tension that's happening right before something happens, the famous calm before the storm understanding, that we have perfect balance and harmony with this chiastic or X-shaped composition that balances it, yet we know that violence is imminent. The same type of balance can be seen in Euphronios and Euxictios, the painter and potter respectively, for the death of Sarpedon. Here, in a red figure Kylix crater, we have an 18-inch high vessel, which is a punch bowl that would be set out during a symposium that you would be able to ladle wine from. These symposia were Greek gatherings of men, generally of the upper class or aristocratic circles, where they would discuss politics, philosophy, and once again be entertained by hetairae and or very educated prostitutes and or pederastic companions or boys that would fill their cups as a cupbearer. These symposia are going to transform into our modern academic understanding of a symposium, where we gather together and exchange academic information. Here in this particular decoration, we have Sarpedon, the son of Zeus, who is killed during the Trojan War. We know he is dead because of the death pose he is in, the limp arm falling to the ground, and then the 3 different wounds out of which blood pours. He is killed by the Greek warrior Patroclus in the Trojan War, who is Achilles' best friend, and here he is carried into the underworld. Now, Patroclus, Achilles' friend, is going to then in turn be killed by Hector in revenge for killing one of Zeus's children. And of course, in turn then, you find that Achilles fights for the body of Patroclus for funerary rites, and then returns and kills Hector in turn. Thus ends the Iliad with the death of Hector and him being dragged off. Athena, remember, is pro-Greek, and so helps Achilles defeat Hector. And so we have this eye for an eye conflict where one Greek hero dies, then one Trojan hero dies, back and forth. In the painting, we have Hypnos and Thanatos, which are identified by the Greek words coming out of their mouths, as well as Hermes, who is identified by the words spelled out behind his head. He carries the caduceus and has wings on his head and feet, showing us that he is the messenger god, delivering male news for male gods. We find that Iris delivers female messages, we will discuss later on. So these are going to be psychopompoi. They are going to be creatures that transition us from one plane of existence to the next. And Hermes does this as well, moving us from the land of the living to the land of the dead. Now, the balance here we should take note of will become a primary compositional device in the classical era. So it looks like they're moving from left to right, carrying the body of Sarpedon, lifting up his legs and then lifting up his shoulder, while Hermes, his feet are going to be pointing to the right, but he's turned around to the left. And so we find there is a balanced X-shaped composition anchored in the center on the vertical axis with Hermes. The counterbalancing diagonals can be traced from the left leg of Sarpedon up through the wing of one of the psychopompoi. Then the fallen left arm of Sarpedon up through the wings of the opposing one. This motion is going to suggest that the figures can move, but are currently balanced perfectly in this moment. Now the compositions are very much like the Achilles, Ajax, and Achilles composition. However, the Ajax and Achilles has very little interest in real space, because you'll notice it's pushed up to the surface and written on. We don't move back into the space to understand figures. They are not overlapping one another, for instance. Here, we find that Sarpedon's body twists in space. His leg is sharply foreshortened at an angle to the picture plane if you note his left leg here. Thus, it's suggesting that we can move back into this space, that he is twisting. He is in front of Hermes, who is behind him, and also that the two psychopompoi are going to be straddling either side of him here. This interest in space is going to be carried on in sculpture in a monument that foretells the transition to the classical era on the island of Aegina. Here at the Aegina, we have the Temple of Apphia, which is a peripteral, meaning a freestanding series of columns around a central cella. A peripteral temple, a Doric order temple, on a hill overlooking the sea. Now this is common as we turn to look at acropoli throughout the Greek world. They choose, just like the Mesopotamian civilizations before them and the Egyptians, to associate what is high with divinity and the gods. So they will choose the natural projection or hill, the highest point in any area, and build a temple on top of that so that the surrounding environment can see it, can look up and be reminded that the gods are protecting them. It also affords another aspect of Greek sculpture and architecture, and that is it treats the structure like a sculpture itself.
It is not surprising to find this explosion in temple building, for it was Psamtik I who opened Egypt to the Greeks in 664 to 610 BCE. At this time, these monuments would be widely available to the Greeks, like the hypostyle hall at Karnak.
Here we have 6 columns on the facades and 12 on the sides, giving us a perfect 1:2 ratio for ancient Greek temple design. The temple itself is going to be reconstructed here with wood and terracotta tiles at the top on the roof that has since rotted away. In the center, we have the cella, but in order to get to the temple at all, we find, as is true for most acropoli, just like the Acropolis in Athens with the Parthenon, that we're controlling how we see the structure by adding a wall, a short parapet, all the way around the precinct, this religious area. So we find that the temple will then have an altar on the east side of the temple, thus facing the sun. The propylaea, or gatehouse, gives us entrance to this holy area. And then we will always set aside lodgings for priests to always attend to the gods' needs. Now this is the opposite of ancient Egypt, because in Egypt we have long processional approaches. Nearly a mile off we are able to see the temple coming, getting larger and larger. And it is understood as a flat facade, not as a sculptural ensemble, because the Egyptians want to communicate the permanence, the immobility, the eternity that the pharaohs represent in association with the gods. The Greeks, on the other hand, their gods are merely immortal humans that don't die, so they do not have the same type of unchanging notion of nature. They believe that it is always changeable. So we have this understanding of their temples as sculptural masses. They are closed and compact and invite you to walk around them and have sculptural decoration around them, not go inside, because only the priests and acolytes go inside of these temples. Now there are three main parts to Greek temples: the columns, which is the post and lintel system, the entablature, which can have decoration on it, and the pediment, the triangular section on top, which also can be decorated. On the example that we're looking at here, both of the pediments at Aegina are going to be decorated with the Trojan War and represent the transition from the archaic to the classical. For we begin with the decoration on the side here at 500 BCE with an archaic example. The figures and their placement on the pediment, this triangular arrangement, is going to be dictated by the shape of the space they are allocated. These life-size warriors are going to fall down around the edges as it tapers down to the sides of the entablature. And we find they all center around Athena as a warrior here, as the goddess who's going to be overseeing and protecting the Greeks. Athena is on the Greek side in this instance. Figures fall or crouch on the tapering areas at the edges of the pediment. Here we have an archer, often called Paris, as he is going to crouch, preparing to fire a bow and arrow towards the center of this. Now, he is archaic in the sense that he is fleshed out as far as his anatomy. We do not have a clear focus on the defined musculoskeletal system. And he's also rigidly in profile view. So these figures are either going to be in profile or they're going to be frontal. Very awkwardly positioned in some instances because they are restricted in the archaic era to these positions. Originally, we must remember that these figures would all be polychromed with encaustic and very brightly painted. So here we have, through ultraviolet X-ray fluorescence and microscopy, the coloration that would have been painted on these figures very brightly, with nearly orange-colored hair, bright pink lips, flesh tones for the hands and feet, and then a very bright series of overlaying diamond shapes of green, blue, and orange on his sleeves and in his pants. This is very similar to the decorations we looked at earlier in the archaic examples. The figure is often called Paris because it is an arrow that fails Achilles in later tradition. The arrow, supposedly shot by the Trojan prince and brother to Hector, that being Paris, is going to be guided by Apollo in this tradition, who is the patron of Troy, because Zeus forced him to build the walls of Troy. So he is pro-Trojan. So we find that, in tradition, the mother of Achilles, Thetis, dips him in the river Styx, making him invulnerable to attack, except for the area she held, which was the back of his foot. So we have his only weakness being the Achilles heel. Here we have the dying warrior at the edge of the pediment, on the same side as the archer. And we will note again that the figures are only going to be shown fully frontal or fully in profile. And so the warrior here still has the archaic smile, which is very undecorous and inappropriate for a warrior who has an arrow coming out of his chest that he is pulling out. We originally would have had bronze accessories, and it would have been very brightly painted. The reaction, though, and the pose that he collapses into is not entirely believable or naturalistic. And so the restrictions placed on the positions of figures in the archaic era will give way here on the other side of this temple to a new approach with the same subjects just a decade later. So we can see here, comparing the archer to the dying warrior, that the figures are restricted by this stylistic vocabulary as to how they can move and how they can function and react to certain scenarios. In this case, one is smiling while he lays dying with an arrow in his chest. Just 10 years later, on the other side of the temple, on this next east pediment that is decorated, we have a very interesting evolution that happens very rapidly. With the same types of figures, we still have archers, we still have dying warriors, and we still have Athena overseeing these Greek warriors. We now have a new approach. For just a decade later, we have a greater interest both in anatomy, spatial construction, and pathos. Here we find that the warrior who is felled, about to die, has fallen to the ground and precariously balances himself on his shield, trying to pull himself up off of the ground. If we compare the expression of this warrior to the archaic example, we note that he no longer smiles. The archaic smile is noticeably absent. Instead, it is replaced by genuine suffering and pathos. We find that he cringes. He is trying to control his suffering, yet at the same time we see the pain in his eyes and his expression. We now note he also has a beard, showing he is a mature warrior. This transitions into the ideal we will talk about in the classical era. Turning to the position of these figures, we can see that the awkward frontal and profile position that the original archaic dying warrior is in gives way to a more natural foreshortened position of the leg of this warrior, and as he twists around to try to push himself up with his right arm as he balances his shield with his left arm. Thus he activates different planes, contorting his body in space, thus showing us that he's activating different planes in space. So capable of turning now, we have this softness of flesh balanced by a sophistication of anatomy, a sophisticated understanding of the different muscular groups and what they do as they move in space. Now, the emotional involvement of the spectator here empathizes with this fallen warrior who is in agony. He is vulnerable at this point. He is at the end of his life. Therefore, we appreciate the suffering of the figure. The transition to the early classical period that we see here is going to take its cues from the characteristics that are discovered in innovations in vase painting we just looked at, such as in the death of Sarpedon, where we start to consider that there is space behind the surface and we can actually move figures to occupy that space more realistically. Next time, we will continue this evolution looking at early and high classical sculpture, specifically freestanding sculpture, as the Greeks developed their ideal, which is a perfect individual or athlete, an Olympian who participates in the Olympics and or is godlike.